Greetings and welcome to the basement. This is a Unity in 5 minutes video where I cover a topic in Unity in 5 minutes or less. Today's topic, terrains. Let's get started. To add in a terrain, you go to Game Object, 3D Object, Terrain. By default, the terrain will be added into 0, 0, 0. You can reposition it if you need it to be centered. Starting off with the settings, there's far too many in here to go over in 5 minutes. The most important ones, terrain width, terrain length, terrain height. This measures in meters, if you're using the default Unity measurements, of how large your terrain is. 500 by 500 is pretty darn big. Also, a terrain height difference of 600 is pretty darn huge. You probably don't need to put it up more than that unless you're doing something very specific. Going back over to the tools, raise, lower terrain. Click to raise, hold down shift to lower. Pretty simple. Brush size and opacity. The brush size controls, well, how large the brush is. There is a 100 brush and there is a 1 brush if you can actually see that little blue square. Opacity controls how fast things adjust. A very low opacity causes things to adjust very, very slowly, whereas a high opacity causes things to move up really darn fast. Moving on to talk about the brushes. These various brushes are the default ones that you can have, and they pretty much do exactly what they look like they do. You can customize the brushes. You don't have this brush. You can do that by creating a gizmos folder inside your primary assets folder and saving out transparent PNG images. They must have the file name format of brush underscore and then a number, and you must start with 0. You will usually have to restart Unity in order for these brushes to appear. You will also probably have to check alpha is transparency depending on how you generated your pings. Going back to the terrains and moving on, we have Paint to Height. Paint to Height has two very useful features. One is flattening, so if I set my height to 5, it will flatten my entire terrain to a height of 5. I can now come back here and shift click and lower terrain. Notice I cannot lower past 0. Makes sense. Coming back over to Paint to Height, I can also grab a height. So let's say I've got this little mountain ridge here and I want to build a platform off of here. I can go to Paint to Height, shift click, grab that height, which is apparently 67 point something, and now I will paint to that specific height value. Moving on, smoothing does what it says. It smooths things out. A high opacity will do what I like to call melting the terrain, which is usually a little bit easier to see with some nice spiky jaggy stuff. So it just sort of melts that down into nothingness. A lower opacity will of course get you much finer smoothing. Textures. The first texture that you add on will be the texture for the entire map. So if I go to Edit, Add, and select, type in cliff, because I will add in the default cliff that is included with the terrain assets. Add it, there it is. So I can add in additional ones to be able to paint additional things down. So if I want to add in the grass hill albedo, oops, and I think I shifted, yep, I did. Grass hill albedo, there we go. Now, quick note about the size setting here. This is the stamp size in meters, so I'm saying every 15 meters stamp this texture. Depending on how far away or how close the player will be will depend on what size you want to use. Generally speaking, for grasses and things like that the player's going to be fairly close to, you're going to want a low value, whereas for things like this rock here, you're going to want, generally speaking, higher values if it's going to be something that the player's going to be looking at from a distance. To paint this down, same thing. We've got our brush settings. Opacity controls how fast it goes. Target strength is our new value. How strong do we want this to be? If I set this to 0.25, it doesn't matter how much I move my mouse over. The target strength will not go past 0.25. 1, obviously, is completely full. Be warned, it applies every single frame that the mouse is moving. So opacity values of any degree really will very rapidly paint down to full strength. You generally want to work with this one on a fairly low opacity if you actually want to be able to slowly apply a texture to a surface. Moving on to trees. You can add in anything that's a mesh as a tree. I highly recommend against that. I recommend that you actually stick with speed trees. It's not going to stop you though. Add in the tree. And now I can paint down this tree. Notice we don't have our brushes, we just have a single circular brush. Brush size determines the area in which we plonk down our trees. Tree density determines how many trees we can plant down. So a tree density of 100 and 1 click gives us that. There's a tree density of 10 and 1 click gives us that. If you want to plant 1 tree at a time, you set your brush size to 1, and now I can plant 1 tree at a time. It will not stop you from placing an absolute ton of trees in the same spot. Don't do that, it's not good for performance. Shift click will erase trees, or alternatively, control click will erase just this tree selected. I've only got one, so we can't really definitely see that. You do have the ability to vary your tree height and your tree width. Moving on to details. We have, this is where we put down our grasses and detail objects. Detail objects cannot have collisions. So even though you can add in models, these models will not have collisions. Keep that in mind. This is for like ground cover, like if you want to decorate down like little trash items or things like that. To add this in, we go to edit. I'm going to add in a grass texture to begin with. For your grass textures, they need to be billboards. So, in other words, like that. You do not want to add in a regular texture like that. That's not going to look good. You want something that is a billboard. You do have the ability to vary the width, vary the height, noise spread, and color it within a certain range within these two colors here. This can make for some very interesting colored grass, but we'll deal with that later. All right, so brush size, again, controls how large our brush is. Opacity, this is one of those ones you really want your opacity down low. Target strength behaves a little bit weird with grasses. Can't really explain it in 5 minutes. Notice I start painting down, nothing happens. Why? Draw distance. Going over to our settings, we can see that our detail distance is set to 80 meters. Past that, we can't see. I can bump this up to 250 so that way I can see things easier. Be wary of leaving that in production. That can cause performance issues, having draw distances too far out. Get back over here to my brush, and now I can brush this down. Notice that even with a fairly low opacity setting, I am plonking down the grass pretty darn quick. If I have my opacity up really high, I get really heavy grass really fast. Again, shift-click will enable us to delete. And that would be terrains in, well, a little bit more than 5 minutes. Until next time, have fun creating.